In this episode, we present our argument for the objective truth of ethics. Welcome to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Shannon Ray. And before we get to the main recording of this week, I'd like to say a few things. So, listening to the recording while editing, I made the observation that for a lot of people, it's probably not clear what's going on here. And I imagine for people who have been listening to the podcast from the beginning until now, it might feel as though I have deviated from the original mission of the podcast. So one of the things I take pride in of this podcast is that everything is made from a reasoned argument. And that the whole point is that everything should be verifiable through observations, and it should all be logical and reasonable. And because of that, it can create a bridge between realities. And recently, you may hear that I'm using more religious language in the podcast, which might put people off. I don't know. And quite frankly, I kind of don't care, because another essential core to this podcast is just speaking as sincerely as I possibly can. And so this is just where I'm at in my life right now. And I'm at a point in my life where I have come to the deep realization that logic and reason is just not sufficient. It's not big enough. It's not complete enough. And that if you have a life that clings to logic and reason as your God, as like your most sacred, then you are going to fall short, and you are going to live in a small, tiny bubble of all of what life has to offer. Because if you want to become a podcaster so that you can provide for your family, there's no guarantee that it will work. There's no guarantee that you will gain an audience and that people will follow you. If you want to become the champion boxer or a champion UFC fighter, there's nothing guaranteed that says you'll even make it to the UFC. But to even attempt it, you have to take a leap of faith that it's possible. You have to just believe before there's the clear evidence. Now, you don't jump into leaps of faith based off of nothing. Like, there should be some sort of logical reason for why you want to take the leap in the first place. And so, as a person who, prior to believing in God, told himself that he worshipped logic and reason, I tried my best to construct a full picture of reality. But what I found is that it essentially gets you up to a point. Like, you can read into a lot of things, but it gets you up to a point. And then from there, you need to have a faith component to be completed. And so, if you remember from the first episode, or the second episode of the first season, Are We in a Simulation? And Oyani and I are talking about building a bridge between other people's perceptions of reality, so that you can have a coherent reality so that we can build, so we can live in the same simulation together. And I made a statement saying that the reason why we cling to the physical is because it follows a consistent set of rules that anyone can verify. So if you make an argument from there, then you should be able to use logic and reason to bridge people's realities. And it's much more difficult to do that based off of faith. And when I said that, I was conscious to say more difficult instead of impossible, because it is more difficult, but I don't think it's impossible. And so with that in mind, part of what I've constructed with the podcast is it makes it easier to hear people of faith. So in the fourth episode of the second season, Pointing in the Continuum, I make a plea toward the end of the episode that when you use the language the way that we've constructed it, you can hear religious people better. So I say something like, the point of this podcast is to understand reality by taking out all of the woo, all of the magical stuff, all of the whatever, all the supernatural things, like strip out all of that and then see where the vector points you. And when you do that, you can hear religious people better. Like if you use my definition of spirit, then use that definition to listen to people. And like they don't cut, and what they say doesn't sound like pure nonsense or random noise. Now you can hear them better. But one thing that I failed to realize at that point is that a key element of religious thinking and faith thinking that cannot be projected out is the belief in the supernatural, or the belief that someone has the truth beyond what can be understood through the material and reason. That you cannot project that out. Projecting that out is like taking the color out of it. And I've come to realize that now. And that should be more reflected in what I'm sounding like now, because as a person who constantly struggles with believing in oneself and just kind of like taking risks, I understand so deeply why you need faith. And so when you're listening to this season, and I'm saying something like you have to align yourself with the Spirit of Christ, I can imagine people who started from the beginning and are now maybe put off by how I'm speaking now to think, line with the Spirit of Christ, You know, I can imagine that. I don't know if that's what people are thinking, but I feel like I need to address it. And so what I'm trying to say is that try to use the language that I've constructed until now to try to hear what I'm saying. And when you listen to the first 3 episodes of this season, you'll notice that that Ryan and I are making an effort to point out things like eternal spirit. In the last episode, or maybe it was this episode. No, in the last episode, we made a point to point out, like, what does it mean for a spirit to be eternal? Using the laws of physics. It's the same argument that I used in the episode Archetypes and Eternal Spirits. The same argument where I'm talking about the set of configurations that are consistent with the laws of physics versus the set of configurations that are not consistent with the laws of physics. And so the set of configurations that are consistent with the laws of physics are something like an eternal set of valid configurations. And so when I'm talking to you and I'm programming you and your physical configuration is changing from a state prior to hearing my voice to after, that you are going through a trajectory into space of all valid configurations of the universe. And each one of those configurations pulls a different mode of being, a different spirit from the set of valid configurations. And so when I say something like the Spirit of Christ, or, be aligned with the Spirit of Christ, I'm saying, imagine that spirit is one that is a valid configuration. And if you're someone who is thinking more in a rational, materialistic way of thinking, just think of it like you're trying to be like a Christian. You're trying to live like Jesus. Like, you read the Bible, there's a character there that has a bunch of ways of acting and behaving, and you're trying to mimic it. And when you mimic it, you pull that spirit out of a set of possibilities and you act that out. And so that's the purpose to all of this argument that we make about the Spirit of Christ. Think of it that way. Even if for a religious person, that's still like, okay, well, that's still not exactly what we're saying, but it's almost like try to walk the line of reason as far as it can go. And what you'll find, at least what I found, is that you're going to reach a point where you're trying to leap to a deeper understanding. And that gap can't be filled by reason. There's like some degree to which that gap has to be filled with faith. And so right now, I'm on my own faith journey. I'm looking to complete myself. And so I'm going to church. And the reason for that is I am a scientist. So what is the spirit of science? It is to have a theory that can produce hypotheses that can be tested. And if you can predict the future, then you start to verify the theory as true. And so in the Bible, it tells you things like, to really actually find out whether or not this is true, you need to open your heart to the fact that it might be true, and then act out a life based off of faith, and then see the fruits. And so there's actually a distinct scientific claim. Do this thing and then see what happens. And so if I am to be a truly rational person and really want to put this book to the test, I have to find a way to actually try to act out a life of faith to see what happens. And it's really difficult. So that's where I'm at. And so hopefully people can hear this and kind of put that in perspective and understand that this comes from a deep, sincere desire to be completed, to feel fulfilled, to find truth. And yeah, I hopefully I can find that. And hopefully you guys are enjoying being on the journey with me as I look for it. But with that being said too, part of the arguments of this season, I use, so when I present the argument for the objective truth of ethics, I use biblical terms in the first and second command of Jesus, like we're made in the image of God, and Jesus' first command and Jesus' second command. And I think for a lot of people, they might hear that as an abandonment of this purely logical approach, but you can secularize all of the arguments I'm making. So they're not contingent on that language. I can secularize them, and the secularization will be based off of the arguments on how identities are formed. And how identities are formed, they're based off of, the idea of, which waveforms or blueprints you have on your physical system, which then determines the configuration of your system, which then determines what spirit you pull out from the space of eternal spirits that are valid configurations of the universe, So you can construct these arguments without having to invoke that language. So try to keep an open mind and listen to it. And if you're someone who is really not religiously oriented and is put off by the Christian language that's in it, or even the Buddhist language, just try your best to listen sincerely and cling to the more logical, materialistic things and try to suss that out the best you can. And hopefully I'm coming off as coherent in some way. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say before the recording, and I hope you guys enjoy it. But before I go, if you could subscribe to the podcast, if you could share it with your friends and other people who might get a benefit out of it, I'd really appreciate it, especially for those who have been listening to the podcast since the beginning. If you want to do me a favor, that will significantly help me. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. So I'm your host, Dr. Shannon Ray, and I'm joined by my special guest, Ryan Scott. And this is our third episode of the fourth season, in which we are trying to establish the objective truth of ethics. And by virtue of the objective truth of ethics, we establish the objective truth of evil, which is like something that subverts the ethics. In the previous two episodes, we've been focusing on the concept of identity, because within our ethical framework, we are establishing ethics firmly in terms of relationships with others. And we're trying to establish the nature of identity and how it's manifested through relationships. So in the previous two episodes, there's certain ideas that we've been using. One, we start off with what we call the meta level zero data, which are things like the no mentation without representation principle. And the example I always use is the idea that if I tell you a secret, you can get up into another room and tell someone that secret, which means I had to program you like a computer, like that information would be stored on your physical system like a memory card. And so what that means is that when we're communicating with each other, we are literally programming each other. And that makes us move in the space of physical configurations that our system can be placed in, and that different physical configurations has a relationship with different modes of being. So if someone comes to you and tells you that your mother died, then you're going to go from the state prior to hearing that to the state after hearing that. And that change in physical configuration is associated with a different mode of being. And so with that understanding, we then have the concept of something like spirit or one spirit, which is related to how one programs the universe, or how something programs the universe, and how it's programmed by the universe. And so as you are interacting with others in your environment, you are moving through the space of configurations, which then changes to your physical state, then changes how you interact with others. And so your spirit changes based off of the change of your physical configuration. And these changes can be observed based on your observed behavior. And so as you're navigating the space of configurations, you're also navigating the space of possible spirits that you can embody. And so far, before I continue, Ryan, you have anything to say? Sound good so far?
Yeah, that sounds fine.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds fine.
So I'm laughing because Ryan's very precise thinker, so I like watching him double check my math. Anyway, so in this idea, so now I'm going to make a rehash an argument.
Sorry, I do.
Oh yeah,
I want to add. I mean, I always want to emphasize this point that we should always be careful about universalization. So, in the context of the construction that you present, it is. I don't have any disputes with the nature of the construction.
yeah,
What I want to say is that the key point that we're trying to emphasize in the context of this discussion is there is a natural relationship between the way we conceptualize the world and the way that we embody ourselves within the world.
mm-hmm.
And we can infer an individual's conceptualizations based on the manner in which he embodies himself.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we could even assert strongly that what he believes about himself and the world necessarily must manifest itself in his behavior.
Yep.
And that I think we should probably go as far to say that if he says he believes something, but he acts in a manner that is contradictory with what he says, then really what he believes is the thing that he is doing, or the thing that
Yes.
can be inferred based on what he's doing.
Yes, something like
And
that. Yeah.
I think the reason why this is so important is because it implies that there is such a thing as integrity, and that consists in the degree to which your conceptualization of yourself and the world is aligned with the manner in which you behave,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And I think it was the previous episode where we were talking about the greater degree to which you embody the set of behaviors which are characteristic of a particular identity is the degree to which you can identify with that particular identity,
Yes. Yes.
right? And
Yes.
so then we can perform an abstraction here, and instead of thinking about a particular identity, we can talk about that which you are as such. And in particular, like if there is such a thing as what if there's such a thing as there being some transcendental or objective personality that you were given when you were born or something like that, like usually what
Mm-hmm.
religious people regard as a soul,
Yeah.
then you have the capacity to be aligned or misaligned with it,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so the importance of this is that if that thing exists, then the plausibility or the possibility of the existence of something like an objective ethic becomes an admissible question.
Well, it's part of
Um,
it. I think that so I would like to say that what you're saying I think is an extension of my perception or my conceptualization of the objective ethics that I didn't have prior to interacting with you. And I think can be incorporated into what I believe. And I in the previous episode did that. So you actually were introducing a new way of perceiving ethics in this idea of the name God gave you that I hadn't previously done.
mm,
Um, and so one of the things that I want to say as you're pointing out the importance of everything I rattled off at the beginning of the episode is that it's all based on observation. So that's why I always say spirit is related to or is associated with how you program the universe and how you're programmed by the universe. It's kind of an encapsulation of the
um,
idea, but an encapsulation of the idea of you'll know them by their fruits. So you're trying to,
yeah,
so whenever you're interacting with somebody, you're asking, who am I interacting? Who is this? And there's certain modes of being, certain spirits that can be embodied, like the deceiver. Am I interacting with the deceiver right now? And you need to know that, otherwise you're screwed. So part of this person's identity becomes, oh, don't listen to that person, he's a liar, he's a deceiver, he has that spirit, and I know this based off of all these things that he's done, don't trust him. And so this is what we're dealing with. And the last part of this argument that I wanted to make is this idea of the eternal spirit. So I make this argument in the second season episode called Archetypes and Eternal Spirits, which archetype might not be the correct word based off of interacting with Ryan, but that's the name of the episode, where I make the argument that every observed configuration of the universe is valid, is consistent with the laws of physics. So when I say to be a physicist is to conceptualize reality using the symmetries of the universe, which is to say that when we construct a physical theory, what we're saying is that when the universe goes from state A to state B in a physical interaction, that there is something that's conserved, or there's a symmetry there that's conserved during that interaction. And then we use that to create equations so that we can take in the input data and predict the output data. And so every configuration that you observe in the universe has to be consistent with the laws of physics. And so every spirit that can be embodied, like the deceiver that can be observed, is an eternal, assuming that the universe, there is a true symmetry and there is an eternal non-changing nature to the universe. I don't know if it's like bleeding or something like that. Maybe it's just changing at a rate that's so large we can't tell. But assuming that, what's that?
Well, so even those caveats don't really matter, specifically because even if you require there to be changes, you can like think at one level higher and say, okay, well, even if I'm requiring there to be changes, if I'm considering the segment of time or the segment of space-time that we are in, it is manifestly true that this configuration must hold in this
time scale or something.
I mean, it needs to hold. It's just like this. Like, even if the Earth is a transient object, it's definitely true that the circumstances which produce the configuration of the Earth right now, that must be an eternally valid thing. Because otherwise the Earth wouldn't be able to exist. Right? So the circumstances that admit the capacity to be a deceiver in the context of a social setting among human beings, that is an eternally valid configuration under the constraints that we're considering, like the things that we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason why it's eternally valid is because its own construction is its proof. If it were not a valid configuration, it would not be able to manifest.
Yes.
So we don't even need to put in the caveats.
Yeah, I only put those caveats in because I haven't thought through the details, and it's only my imagination that someone could come in from there. So I put the caveats in.
No. I mean, there is no possible way. There's no possible way to deny that, because what you would need to do is you would need to deny the possibility of the existence of something like a deceiver in a social setting under the constraints of what it is to be human. But we already know, by virtue of the fact that those people behave that way, that is sufficient, necessary and sufficient condition for the proof of the existence of that thing. So there is no objection.
Okay.
And I would say that this isn't even necessarily my argument. This is Kant's argument in his Critique of Pure Reason.
Okay. All right. Well, I love that then. So I will no longer add that caveat, or I'll investigate more to understand that deeply. But the point is that with the point of physics is that we're predicting the future based off of this idea of something being symmetric. And so the argument that I made in the Archetype of the Eternal Spirits is something like the spirit of Shannon, the thing that's talking to you now, or the spirit of Oyani, is a valid configuration. It's an eternal valid configuration of the universe, in that it is obviously a valid configuration. So the laws of physics create a demarcation between the space of configurations that are valid versus ones that are not valid. And so when you are trying to navigate this space of configurations that I established, when you're navigating your space of configurations, you're navigating the space of spirits that can be embodied, or kind of like being pulled down into and realized in a physical way. So these are all meta level zero observations. Everything that we're saying is related to this idea of the laws of physics and how they work. And so this idea of eternal spirits that can be embodied. Everything is based off of how something interacts. So you can look at its fruits to see, okay, who am I interacting with right now? What spirit is this? And so that establishes the notion of identity that we need to then extend the truth of those meta level observations to the idea of ethics. Um, so that's kind of a recap of what we've been doing up until this point. So yeah, and so in the previous episode, the idea of identity, and maybe we don't have to rehash the whole thing. You can just go back and listen to it. But we started establishing the idea of macro identities versus micro identities, and the idea that your identity doesn't belong to you alone. Different modes of being that can exist, like for instance, the spirit that can do calculus. I can identify with that spirit. I'm a physicist, I'm a mathematician. You can identify with that spirit, but someone else can study and embody that spirit as well. And so think of mathematician as one identity that I have, and that's a macro identity. And then you can think of when you're trying to point to Shannon in the space of spirits, you take the set of all of his macro identities. He's a father, he's a male, he's a scientist, all of the things that point to me instead of pointing to Ryan. Those are all my macro identities. You can take those and you can see how each one of those can exist in somebody else. And so I can say something like, when I see another mathematician, I see myself over there. And so because these different configurations or blueprints or waveforms, whatever you call them, can be placed on different physical matter, then you can see the degree to which that self is it's something that is not local only to you, but exists within others. And then also you have this idea of whatever spirit is associated with scientists. It's something like, even if I'm not interacting with Ryan, if I want to embody that spirit, I have to follow its rules. I have to obey its laws, and I have to take actions that keep me closer to it, that keeps my configuration closer to it, such that I can continue to do calculus. It's like boxing. If you don't use it, you lose it,
Yep.
things like
Yep.
that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is, yeah. Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I want to continue to reiterate this point
Mm-hmm.
because it's always a possibility that if somebody deals with the name scientist and then varies the underlying meaning of the thing,
Yeah.
then the thing that you get closer to, that like imagine your behavior is in alignment with one interpretation of the sense of scientist,
Yeah.
and then somebody comes along and then varies that radically, then your behavior is no longer in line with what they are calling scientist. Your
Yes.
behavior is in line with something else. Okay.
Yes.
But your behavior is still in line with what your interpretation of a scientist was previously.
Yeah.
So if we focus on the thing that you are aligning with, independent of what you call it, then
Yes.
that becomes an objective process that is independent of naming.
Yes.
And then you can speak meaningfully and in an objective way the degree to which you are aligned with it, assuming we have the capacity to conceptualize a set of behaviors that characterize this thing, regardless
Yes.
of who or what is trying to align with that thing, right? Like, so,
Which is to say, I think you can summarize it in that even if you change the labels, the behavior doesn't change.
yeah, that's
And
right.
so, yeah, and so
Yeah,
that's the
and
core of it.
yeah, and I think that this is a very, very essential. I mean, there are important caveats here because you have to worry about whether or not you can conceptualize this thing prior to its naming. And you have to worry about whether or not you have the capacity to intuit this thing to a sufficiently coherent degree that you can construct behavior that aligns yourself with it, even in the absence of its name.
Mm,
Now, my personal opinion is that you can do that, and that's the significance and meaning of the Spirit in Christianity, of the Holy Spirit, right?
yeah.
I don't need, and it's also the position of the Catholic Church for that matter. Like, There are individuals who, as long as they behave sufficiently in line with what is typically called like your conscience, you aren't necessarily damned to hell, even if you haven't been baptized. Okay.
Mm, mm.
So,
Okay, that's
but
really interesting. Yeah.
the reason why I want to put so much weight and emphasis on the process rather than the naming
Yeah.
is because one of the core reasons why we're seeing what we're seeing right now is because people are taking the names and pretending like they can just move those things around,
Mm-hmm.
and because they're really they're playing the game of, let me just vary the meaning and keep the name, and then pretend like all of
Yep.
the associations people have with the name
Yep.
persist,
Yep.
so that I can start to shame people when they behave in a way that's consistent with the previous meaning of the term.
Oh yeah, yeah. There, it's. I mean, so this is going to go into our notion of evil. It is
Yeah,
literally the act
it's
of
deception per
put.
se. I
Yes,
mean,
you're putting on the
it's like a
mask.
betrayal. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. You're putting on the mask of the thing,
Yep.
but while the spirit of you're hollowing out the spirit that's
Yep.
associated with the name.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's a really true act of evil, because and then it starts to confuse people who
Yeah.
start to think, oh, look at what this thing is doing, and they don't know that no, there's a deceiver that's hollowed out the
Yeah.
spirit, put
Yeah.
on a mask, and is
Yeah. Yeah.
claiming to be that, and that's
Yeah. Yeah.
core to the idea of evil.
Yeah. There's
um
actually there's an internal contradiction in that mode of conceptualization, because I mean, this is just a technical point. You need to simultaneously believe that the only thing that characterizes the meaning of something is its extensionality, which is like the way that it's used or the way that it
mm,
constructs things, while also affirming that what you're going to do is you're going to vary the intentionality or the underlying meaning of the thing in order to transform its extensional structure.
yeah.
Right. So basically, you're saying like the set of things that this thing can do is all that this thing is, but secretly, actually, there's also something that's not just the set of things that the thing can do. And I'm going to change that so that I fundamentally change the set of things that the thing should be able to do. And then I'm going to deny the previous things that it could do. Anyways,
That almost sounds like an argument of the difference of interpretation of law in terms of the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law in some
yeah,
degree. Yeah.
I have a,
We don't have to go
there are
down
a
that
lot of,
rabbit hole, but this is an
no, no,
opposition made
yeah,
years
right.
ago.
That's, I don't, there are a
Yeah.
lot of problems with the notion of law that lose ourselves in, but yeah, let's keep
Yeah.
going
Yeah.
so I think you want to actually sketch your conception of ethics so that we can start to talk about what it means to have an objective one, right?
Yeah. And I think that something that's important is this idea of one's subjective freedom and entering into a contract. And so that
Mm.
act of betrayal is saying something like, I have declared myself as a referee, and I am the referee of a sanctioned referee, and my only job is to to enforce the rule of the fight as they're
Yep.
been deemed by the commission that's given me power. And then you're going in there
Yep.
and changing the outcome of the fight so that you can win bets. That's
Yeah,
like,
sure.
yeah. And so that's a pure violation of the contract. So this starts getting into the idea of ethics. And so think about those eternal spirits, those eternal modes of being that can be embodied, and
Mm.
then think about the idea of we are all going to come together and try to pull that thing from the eternal and manifest it physically. And to do so, we're all going to agree on a set
Yep.
of rules, or a set of behaviors, or a set of modes of being.
Yeah. So I want to modify that slightly because it makes it sound like we're the ones that are building the rules. Um, and I suppose in a sense that's true, but if you're really grappling with something that's transcendental or something that is eternal, then you don't really get to choose what the rules are.
Yes, that's true. Yes, I agree
Like the
completely.
rules are inherent to the thing.
Yep.
Like we just agree on how to express them right now. Like, for example, language literally evolves over time, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So if I want to phrase the First Amendment, right? But if we try to communicate what the First Amendment of the United States Constitution is to somebody who's was alive 3,000 years ago in like Jerusalem, we would literally need to change the phrasing. I mean, we would
Yeah.
literally need to change the language,
Yeah.
right? But that doesn't nullify or transform the fundamental idea, right? Because the essence that makes that conceptualization what it is and not something else
Yeah.
cannot change, because as soon as that changes, then it becomes literally a different conception. And that is independent of language or particular expression. All that the language or the expression do is they give symbolic structure to that thing here now, so that we can deal with them, we can access them or deal with them with respect to the tools that we are used to dealing with.
Yeah, no, I agree it comes because you're trying to emphasize the point that to enter into this contract, there's a degree to which you need to sacrifice or submit to the thing that you're trying to
Yeah,
manifest.
and it's not necessarily the case that we just make it up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
not only do I think that it's not necessarily the case that we just make it up, I genuinely believe that we don't.
yeah.
Like, I mean, I really think that it's much more like divine revelation.
Hmm.
Like, I think that that's really what it is. It's something like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree with that, and that's something we can get into in another episode. But I do think it's something like, yeah, a divine revelation of coming to know. Like, it's like, oh yeah, someone's spoken to you, and you come to realize
Yes,
deeply, like,
yes,
oh, this is
yes,
what it is.
yes,
And this, yeah,
yes,
yeah.
yes, yes. This is
Um,
like when people tell me something like mathematics is made up, like we make mathematics up. I'm like, I've never heard a stupider thought in my life. Like, have you done mathematics? There's
uh,
literally no way I would ever characterize my experience in realizing the truth or the validity of a theorem as me making that up. And
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't think
yeah.
that any mathematician would ever agree to that unless he's very cynical.
Yes, and I think everyone should hear in the audience that this is the spirit of mathematics speaking through Ryan very passionately at the moment.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He is that spirit. So yeah, so where are we at?
You want to define the notion of ethic, I suppose.
So let's set it up. So the thing that I've been trying to establish, hopefully I've done it successfully, that was done in the previous episode, is the idea of shared identity coming together to create the spirit, which requires this submission, which requires this sacrificing of your personal freedom to be in line with something else that you want to embody. And so when you do that as a group, say just like to become a citizen of a nation, or like the idea of a social contract, to enter into a social contract, you give up some of your personal sovereignty so that you can be, so that you can create the spirit of a group. So in this sense, the spirit that is embodied by everyone who's entered into the contract, what's it? It's the shared spirit.
I suppose what you want to say is maybe something like, when we come into to form the identity that's bigger than us,
Yes.
and we enter into a social or group setting in order to do that, then we are thinking about the notion of ethic as subject to the constraint of the particular identity that we are considering. The set of behaviors which are appropriate are those behaviors which maximize the valid expression of that identity within the context of the group.
Yes, and when you do that, then you are saying that that is one of my identities. Like that
Yes.
is, yes, I am that spirit. And this is what we
Yeah.
established in the previous episode. Okay, so now I'm back on track. Group and individual, macro identity, group identity, micro identity, individual identity. Because if Ryan and I are both mathematicians, then that is one of our group identities. But there's all this extra data, all these other micro identities that point to Ryan instead of me. And so there's an individual identity. And so that group identity is made up of a collection of individuals. So
Mhm.
then the idea of ethics is to try to maximize group identity or group power while also maximizing individual identity or individual power. So it's like I'm trying to maximize, like, if I want to establish something like a strong group identity, then I can and maximize that. Then it's like, okay, everyone does this. There's no freedom. Everyone does this. You have no identity outside of the group. So everything you do is a demand on you by the group. But if you wanted to maximize individual freedom, then it's like then you would say, okay, the group desires this group thing, none of that matters. Everything is about what you want, your subjective feeling. So that would be maximizing individual power or freedom. And so when you're trying to maximize both of those at the same time, it really is something like trying to take two polar opposites and make them simultaneously manifested at once.
Maybe you should say something about why you would expect there to be a solution to that process,
Yeah.
right?
Oh
Because
man.
because the sketch that you just posed before us suggests that my individuality and my group identity are opposed so strongly that in any effort to find a compromise between the two of them necessarily means um, that I have to subordinate one to the other.
Yes. Yes.
Right. But your assertion or your definition of ethic requires that a balance be found between these two things
Yeah.
and in such a way that you don't lose one or the other. Or in other words, the key properties of both have to enter into the compromise.
Yes, and this is the idea of free will. So anyone who enters into this compromise is something like you're
Oh,
doing it of your own free will. So it's respecting
okay,
the
good.
free will of the individuals. So what that does then is it makes it to where each individual can maximize their own freedom. It's like what are the minimum constraints necessary that we need so that we can come together and make a cohesive group such
Mhm.
that the spirit that is emerged from our collective has maximum degrees of freedom to enact and behave while still maintaining the spirit that we're trying to
Good.
embody. And
Yeah, good.
so, yes. And so what that does is it's this idea of trying to respect everyone's free will so that they can manifest their version of the spirit
Good.
that's most unique to them to actually truly come together and
Yep.
create the spirit of the whole thing.
Yeah, but so good. So there are two things that I want to say. The first thing is I think that the outline that you put there is spot on. But again, let us emphasize that the embodiment of the spirit always imposes rules on whoever chooses to submit to it, so that
Yes.
it's not purely arbitrary.
Yes.
So there is the possibility of construction of the group per se, right? Because if it were purely arbitrary and you maximize the free will of each individual in
Yep.
manifesting the particular spirit,
Yes.
then there is no spirit, right? Because everybody
Yes.
does whatever,
Exactly.
like arbitrarily.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
There's no coherence.
So
Yes.
so and the other thing that I want to say is that this is actually compatible with the Catholic understanding of faith and free will,
Hmm.
in that serving or subordinating yourself to God's will only means something because
Yes.
you freely engage in it,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So
That's
like you
that,
need
as yeah. As I'm becoming closer and closer to Christianity, this is just like baked in the cake. This is hugely part of it. Yeah.
this is a different project that I'm working on that I hope to flesh out more completely at some point. I think that the great power in the American value system and situating liberty as one of the core
Yep.
principles of the society means that what you're doing is you're collecting individuals together and you're basically saying to them, it is your duty and your right to manifest the soul that God has given to you, and that it is not the right of any other individual to declare that you are not allowed to manifest that which you are,
Yes.
um, or that you need to manifest something other than that which you are.
Yes. Yes.
Right? This isn't like hedonistic, undisciplined toddler manifestation of self. No, I mean, it's a
Yeah.
disciplined, controlled, rigorous understanding of who I am and the expression of that thing. Right? So there's a lot of responsibility in it. But
Mm.
like, I think having that freedom is absolutely essential, because in the absence of that, the identity that you are trying to express is not allowed to be expressed in its fullest manner,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes.
So if you try to truncate or limit. Like, so imagine there's a set of valid behaviors associated with a particular identity.
Mm-hmm.
If some individual comes along and says actually only a subset of those behaviors
Yes,
are
yes,
legitimately
yes,
valid, then
yes.
what you're doing is you're inherently sterilizing the life of the identity itself,
Yep.
because you're limiting the ways in which it's supposed to express itself.
Yes, exactly.
This doesn't mean that it expresses itself in all possible ways. It means that it
Yep.
expresses itself in all possible ways that are compatible with
Consistent.
its nature.
Yep, exactly.
Right.
Yes,
And so
yes,
in the absence of that freedom, then what happens is that, like, things that are appropriate to it are not
yep,
expressed,
yep,
and an injustice is done towards it
yes.
because you're basically nullifying its nature.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And I mean, you can even think about this in terms of computation. So one of my reasons why I'm pretty against communism, and I actually see it as a deeply evil system of thought, it's this idea of at the core of like a free market capitalist society that's
Mhm.
functioning properly. You know, that the core idea, whether it's corrupted or not, but the core idea is something like I have a thing, you want the thing, and we have the freedom to exchange that thing.
Sure.
And so what that does is it increases computational freedom or computational power because what it allows is for whenever there's a need, then any individual can come and choose to fill that need, which means they deal with all the logistics necessary to provide for that need and then get rewarded by being able to get capital and gain capital rewarded for the need that they're providing, which means that what that does is it encourages everyone to seek out what you're saying, the thing that speaks most to them, and then provide that as a benefit for the group and work out the logistics of it. But if you come along and you suddenly say, okay, these set of actions aren't allowed, like means of production, you're not allowed to own a business, cut. So then you're taking all the degrees of freedom that would have allowed an individual to fulfill a need, and you're just reducing those degrees of freedom arbitrarily. So you're literally
Mhm.
cutting down the computational capacity of your society, and that's
Mhm.
part of
Yeah,
that's
that's right.
part of the notion of it.
Yeah, that's right.
And
Yeah,
so
that's right. Yeah.
and so you never want to place more constraints than necessary. You want to
Yeah, that's
place
right.
the minimal constraints
Yeah, that's
necessary.
right.
And so your
Yeah, that's
question
right.
is, what is the minimal constraint? And I'm saying the minimal constraint is the solution to the paradox of trying to maximize group identity and individual freedom at the same time, because you want everyone who has a free will entered into the group to think that is me. I'm fully faithful to that thing. That is me. I obey
Yep.
it, and I want to obey the rule that allows me to claim its identity. But
Yep.
you also want to have your ability to express yourself to your
Yeah,
maximum
yeah. Yeah,
maximum
yeah.
degree.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think so this I think does a really good job of fleshing out the solution to the paradox in the context of a particular identity, but maybe we want to pass to the abstraction and talk about how we solve this problem in general.
Yes. Yes.
And go ahead.
Yes. And so I think the solution to the paradox, as I've stated in the episode Made in the Image of God principle, is that it is the idea that we are made in the image of God, or the Namaste principle. So it exists in both Eastern and Western religions, the Namaste principle or the made in the image of God principle. And it's Jesus' first command and Jesus' second command. I think that those three things together actually create the objective truth of ethics. And what it does is it first establishes this
So
idea.
so
I'm sorry.
so let me modify what you said just a little bit. I mean,
Yeah.
I understand that you're saying you think that it creates the objective truth of ethics, but what I would say is that actually, I think what it does is it gives an expression to the universalization of ethics, right? So it's valid for all possible identities in
Yes.
all
Yes.
possible
Yes. Yes.
circumstances.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. Exactly. And in
yeah.
fact, what I'm claiming is that,
But and
um,
only religious data can ever do that. Like the reason the thing that makes religious data, or the thing that makes these particular things exceptional, is that whenever you want to make these universalized claims, particularly about behavior and things like that, it needs to be associated basically with God.
with the
Like,
eternal. Yes.
yeah,
It's the difference between the worldly, or it's the difference between the eternal and the worldly, the profane and the eternal, or the impermanent from the Buddhist perspective, the impermanent and that which is not impermanent. And so in both Buddhism and Christianity, there's a strong emphasis
Yeah,
on
that's
the
right.
difference between that what comes into existence, lives and dies, and you comes into existence and lives and dies, and that which is always eternal. And
Yeah.
so this idea of this ethic, as you described it, one of its necessary conditions is to be universally applicable for all identities for all time, means
Yep.
that it's always true under all circumstances. And in fact, I think that it is the case that for any identity to be formed, these things are going to have to be true, even if you're doing them for yourself, when you're trying to align oneself, like the community of spirits that exists within oneself, versus
Mhm.
trying to do that outwardly in terms of a community made up of individuals. I think it's also true from all the way down into the internalized individual out to the group as well.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. So you mentioned that you think,
you have to start off with the principle that we're all made in the image of God.
yeah, no, but you mentioned that you think that Jesus's two commands are the sufficient modifiers to the principle that we're made in the image of God solves
Yes,
the paradox. So maybe you want to flesh
explain
that out a
that.
little bit more. Yeah.
Yeah. So, first, the idea that we're made in the image of God is the idea of trying to establish the objective glue that glues together a group to form an identity, a tribe, a religious group, or like we said, in all circumstances of trying to form a shared identity, there has to be, like, you think of this. So think of these macro identities as lowercase g gods. And so think of that as God. So start that off as a lowercase g God. And whenever anyone rallies around it, we all want to be scientists or whatever, everyone rallies around it, then you are saying that we are all made in the image of that thing. So we're all made in the image of that spirit. And so what it does is it establishes the truth of the divine in everybody while not making it exclusive to any one person. So this is the degree to which the
Hold on.
yeah.
So if you're talking about a lowercase g God, you're when you say the divine, you another word that you might substitute for that would also be like establishes that they can commune with something that's transcendental.
Yes.
Okay, all right,
Yes.
good.
And one of the natures of the divine is the capacity to have free will. I think that it's the capacity to be able to choose. It's the capacity to have freedom. It's the subjective freedom. So I'm
Mm,
associating the subjective freedom with the divine. It's like the true sovereign. Like God has the true sovereign, and so this being made in the image of God means that everybody has a freedom to choose and act and behave. And so once you have this idea that everyone who has entered into the contract has done so of their own free will, and even though they've done that, they've given up some of their subjective freedom, but they still have free will. They still have, and
yeah,
that
that's
needs
right.
to, and so that divine thing is like is saying something like, okay, everyone here is divine. Everyone's
Yeah.
equal in the sense that we mentioned in a previous episode, and everyone has free will or the capacity to choose and make their own decisions. So you start off
Mhm.
with that. Then you
Yeah, but we
go,
all we all agree to. So it's like we all agree to abide by the rules that characterize this transcendental thing we're all stand in relation to. But other than those constraints, we agree that we are totally free to act.
yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Your divine essence means that I see that in you, and I have, and so
Hmm.
this goes into Jesus' first principle. So now it's
Hmm.
like, okay, now love God with all your mind, heart, and soul. Like, it's like this, and I'm not saying it exactly right, but essentially that,
Yeah,
love
yeah,
love
yep,
God with
yep,
every bit of your being. So
yeah,
now it's
yep.
like, okay, well, if everyone in this group has the divine essence of God, then that means I have to love them in that same way. I have to revere that essence no matter where I see it, no matter where it manifests. And I need to love it with all of my heart, mind, and soul.
So I would say that that's really the second piece, right? The first piece is when you enter into a relationship with the thing, you don't try to corrupt it by forcing it to your own subjective desires. You willfully submit in a way that you allow its principles and its rules to be expressed through you,
Yes, yes, yes,
right?
yes. And
So,
yeah, no, go ahead.
right. And so then when you start to go and act on its expression in the concrete forms of the individuals who have also entered into communion with it,
Mm-hmm.
that's where loving your neighbor as yourself.
Well, that's the third part. I'm saying the first part is a prerequisite to a second command.
That's definitely true. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
definitely true.
So the first command is place God above anything else. Because if you start to try to control the free will, the essence of God in others, then you're elevating your free will, your divine essence above them. But
Mhm.
because that because they have the essence of God, you are elevating yourself above God. You
Yeah,
have a God complex. Like in
yeah.
other words, the foundation of ethics that I'm establishing is the idea that you have to respect the other people. You don't have the
Mhm,
right to control them or dominate them. And I
mhm,
think that anything else outside of this is going to expose someone's desire to control someone
mhm,
without use of justified force. Because then, if you're
mhm,
using force, my question is, on what authority do you have to use that force? On what
mhm,
authority do you have to use that force? Because God gives authority for judgment for when force is allowed. Which is to say,
mhm,
someone is becoming a deceiver and they're corrupting and they're trying to kill people and
mhm,
they're trying to. It's like, okay, well, I mean, I'm not trying to hurt you, but you are coming to corrupt and kill and
mhm,
deceive. It's like I have no
mhm,
choice but to use force. You have
mhm,
been judged
mhm,
by God. So
mhm,
whenever
mhm,
anyone tries to establish the use of force to control someone else's divine free will, on what authority do you have that? And you better have a damn good answer. So and
mhm,
so this is the idea of the first part. And then once you have this love of God that has been elevated and everyone has that, now you see
mhm,
your neighbor as yourself. And then when you do that, that reinforces the identity that came into existence, that you've come into existence. And I'm saying, when I say lowercase g God, I'm saying any identity that's constructed
mhm,
is going to have to have this nature, lest you allow for corruption
mhm.
and deceit to threaten its existence as it's been manifested into the world through all the data that's been collected on it and all the people who store the memory of that spirit in them, such that they can enact its will and create in a way such that when you observe someone behaving in that way, you go, oh, that person is a scientist.
Mhm.
And I would definitely, I think that this is something like the global minimum. It's the solution to the paradox, and anything that attempts to perturb it will reveal itself to be a deceiver in some way. And I
Mhm.
challenge anyone to attempt to perturb this from the made in God image and Jesus' first and second command.
Mhm.
I really, I try it. I want to see what you come up with.
I think so. Um, Maybe a related, interesting observation or sort of brief sidetrack is if you do or you engage in this process naively, you necessarily make yourself vulnerable to somebody who could deceive you.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, so the individual who seeks to be righteous, what do you think he should do about the fact that he is engaging in something that necessarily makes him more vulnerable to to deception and villainy
Yes,
than
I've
somebody who is less willing to engage in this?
I've discussed this with so many Christians before. Well, Reasonable Fidelis and Nathan. You can see people. It basically it is to trust in the Spirit of Christ, to trust in Christ,
Mhm.
build a
True.
relationship with Him, such that you don't have to walk around the world being fearful. You judge things. You have the desire to judge things as they are as much as possible. And if you are aligning yourself with the Spirit of Christ, and you're purifying your perceptual faculties, so that you're not like you don't have some complex that you're avoiding to know about yourself that then leaves an opening for someone to
Yeah,
come
you
in
become
because you're
better at
unwilling.
discerning when people are trying to deceive you, for example.
Yes, yes.
Mhm.
And the idea is then is that you open your heart to others. And if it's like if someone tries to present a clearly logically false argument to you, you're like,
Mhm.
this you're not even good. Like deceivers are become weaker the more you are aligned with the truth and the more you're aligned with Christ, the weaker deceivers become. Because it's like you know how logic works. You
Well,
know
they
for
have
a
nothing.
fact.
They have nothing to offer you. They have nothing to offer you, and they have nothing to take from you.
And it's like what you
Because
said in the first episode of this season, which is where does the evil have to lie? In the weak, in the pathetic, in the remember that's what you're saying. So if you're like what's it strengthening your spirit through Christ, you're not going to walk around being worried about being deceived all the time. You're going to see it.
good.
And I think that that's the solution, and you can see it in people who don't have a trusting nature. You can see them walk around and fearful. And I mentioned this in the episode "All Is One."
Yeah,
This same thing.
yeah. That's a good point. I think also Christ's dictum to love your enemy is probably also relevant in this situation,
Yeah.
um, because I think probably the most basic thing you can do to demonstrate love for your enemy is to offer them, what would I say? It's to invite them to sit at the table. Like
Hmm.
basically, it's something like, look, the onus is on you to present yourself as one who is not worthy of being trusted.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
um, now we should be careful because if you invite 9 politicians into your house and they've all deceived you, and a 10th one comes, it like that doesn't mean that you should just open the door.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
it's okay to ask questions.
Well, hopefully you'd have the discernment to know when you're like, okay, this person, this like, okay, I got the sense that I should remove myself from you. You know what I mean? Like if you have a sense that like you don't
Yeah, you
just go
should. I
walking. You
think.
don't go walking into the den of snakes if you think that you're dealing with like a level 30 snake and you're at level 15 perception right now. You're like, I sense
Sure.
something deep. I'm gonna back
Yeah,
away
sure.
slowly, maybe get some
Sure.
reinforcements.
I think the important thing here is that it's not that it's not that we don't allow ourselves to act upon the discernment that somebody has embodied evil. It's that despite the fact that we are continually
Hey Murphy.
exposed to and even possibly abused by evil, we don't allow it to corrupt.
Sorry, Murphy is that Murphy jumped on my
No,
back. Sorry,
it's
go
okay.
ahead.
We don't allow the continual interfacing with evil to corrupt that which is within us that allows us to harmonize with other individuals who are good.
Yes, exactly, and that's exactly what you said. That was the point I was going to make when you said, "Why is it that you should be loving to your enemies?" It's because if you're not, then that hatred or the negative nature or
Yeah,
evil
it
nature of
infects
that thing
you.
will infect you.
Yeah.
You stare at the void long enough, they'll stare back at you, and this is precisely what it means to be Christ-like. Like the
Mhm.
spirit of Christ is one that can take any negativity, any evil, any sin, and purify it never
Mhm.
corrupted. And because if you ever interact with someone who is just mired in sin and they're lying and they're deceitful and they're doing all these things, then you can look at that and it starts to corrupt you. It's like, why are they being like that? It's actually so
Mhm.
easy to get angry at someone else for messing up, to not be who they're supposed to be, and like watching it, and then you start judging them, and it's so easy for people to be corrupted. And this is why
Yeah.
when I see people who are trying to fix a system that has corruption in it, whether or not they're a good enough person, or whether or not they have enough gratitude to take on that evil without it corrupting them, and the degree to which
Yeah.
they are filled by the slightest amount of negative or imperfection is the degree to which it's like it's telling you about the depth of their spirit
Yeah.
and the ability for them to
It's like endure and overcome. Yeah, right,
yes,
exactly.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. I think we hit all the things that you're like that I think actually outlines the argument quite well, right? So
Yes. Well, I do want to do one
the
more thing, which is I want to revisit the conversation we had in the first episode of this season, talking
oh,
about
okay,
and
sure,
to examine why it is that mode of being, which is to say, you must agree with my subjective use of a word, otherwise I'm going to damage your reputation. is so evil.
Oh, okay. Sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So now you want to consider an example or an application. Yes. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Go ahead.
And so the thing is that I think for a lot of people, when they hear me get so upset about some of these woke ideas and claims that are made, which especially the one that's something like, unless you agree with someone's self identification, then you are immoral and then you are a bad person, such that I'm allowed to claim that you're responsible for them harming themselves. I'm allowed to claim that you're denying their existence. I'm
Mhm.
allowed to claim
You are the
that
source of their suffering.
you are the source of their suffering,
Yeah.
you're making all of those claims, which is to say that I am purposely using the force of ruining your reputation, because now why don't we gossip? Because when you gossip about someone, you spread negative information such that that information is stored on people, so that when they interact with that person, it changes the interaction. You are literally changing their spirit based on the
Hmm.
definition that we use in this podcast. You are
Hmm.
literally
Hmm.
changing their spirit. You are harming it. You are so this is the point. It's like this is the difference between meta level 0 and meta level 1. Meta level
Hmm.
0, I come to you and I put a gun to you and I shoot you. Okay, obviously you used force, violence, that's wrong, that's bad. Meta level
Hmm.
1, I'm going to gossip about you and harm your reputation. And
Hmm.
while saying that I'm doing it for a good cause. Now suddenly we can't tell that violence is happening anymore.
Hmm.
It's like you're not understanding the nature
Well, you
of
can tell violence is happening, but it takes a long time to realize that that's what was going
and
on.
not only that, but it's very easy to lie. Like if you don't want to see the violence, it's way easier. If someone is going around punching people
Oh
in the
yeah, that's
face,
true.
it's
Yep.
much more difficult for you to deny what's occurred. But when someone
Yep.
goes around and starts harming people's reputation and saying, "Oh, I'm
Yep.
a good guy," and if you want to believe it, you can just keep telling yourself anything you want
Yep.
at meta level 1.
Hmm.
And so let's break down the situation and the argument that's happening here. You're essentially saying something like there is a shared language that has words in it, and we use these words to communicate. And the degree to which these words have anything coherent, such that I can predict how they'll program you, is the degree to which we both agree on the meaning of the word. So the value of these words, the objective nature of these words comes with our agreement, which means that it's a shared set of concepts that we all have access to and we all share. So that's what we're starting off with. And then someone goes, I'm going to take these words and radically change their meaning so that they actually mean the opposite of what they were before. And so you're like, wow, that's a huge thing you're asking for. That's a big deal. Why are you asking to do that? Oh, because there's this group of people over here that if you don't adopt my use of this language, if you don't adopt that, then these people are going to feel bad, and they're going to feel bad. So then it's like, yeah, but the thing you're asking me to do is inconsistent with my relationship with these words, and in fact, it's inconsistent with the entire coherent structure of my spirit. Like when you ask me to do this, I feel like I'm lying to myself every time I do it. And you can look at Dave Chappelle's stand up,
Hmm.
his comedy special, The Dreamer, where he uses a bit where he's talking about what's the guy's name? Jim Carrey. And Jim Carrey is playing Hoffman, some comedian, something Hoffman. I can't remember what his name is. And so
Oh, do you mean Andy Kaufman?
Andy Kaufman, yes,
Yeah.
and he's
Yeah.
playing Andy Kaufman in the movie Man on the Moon, I think.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And so in the skit, he's saying that he met Jim Carrey while he was playing that role, and Jim Carrey completely started having people call him that, to the point where on set someone's like, "Don't call him Jim. He's Andy. Don't call him Jim." And so Dave is saying like, I was so amazing to see someone and the depth of their craft creating. He's like, but I was upset because this entire time they're telling me to call him Andy, and I know that it's Jim. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like that's the way these people make me feel. You know, the those who made, I guess like, you can't be named them or whatever, but you know, the certain set of people. And so
The
this is how
Voldemorts.
and so
Yeah.
And so it's like that expression that he gave in that stand up is exactly my feeling and exactly the feeling of so many people when you talk to them. It's like, I know that this is not what it says it is. And every time you ask me to do it, it feels like I am lying. You're telling me to lie to the core of my being. And that's even outside of the logical structure of the language of these words that they're proposing, that when you analyze them logically, you understand that they're based on words that have no capacity to point in one concept versus another concept. And that's another argument we'll make later. But it's like my spirit of
Right,
the
right, right,
rational,
right, right,
my identity of the rational is telling me that you're asking me to fundamentally do something
yeah,
irrational
right,
to make these people,
right,
to make a group of people feel
right,
better, which
right,
is to
right,
say that you're telling me to sacrifice my identity to validate their identity. So then the
right.
question is, what about me? What about my feelings? Why is it that my identity and my feelings should be subordinated
Well,
to
because
this
they
group?
sneak in a hierarchy, right? They sneak in a hierarchy, and you fall somewhere in the hierarchy which is beneath.
But the whole point at the end of the day is the idea that I view this as nothing more than a use of force.
That's right. Yeah.
It's a use of force to try to dominate my feelings and my spirit to accommodate the feelings of somebody else. And when you ask people, it's like okay, well, but let's take Rachel Dolezal, the woman who identified as black, the white woman who identified as black, and then
Yeah.
when she said that, everyone just pilloried her into oblivion. It's like, okay, well, if a white person comes and tells me they're black and says that if I don't agree, then they're going to harm themselves or something like that, it's like, do I have to do it then? If someone comes to me and says that they're funny and I don't think they're funny and I don't affirm that, it's like, do I have to do it then? Like, how does this work? Like, how do we discern when something immoral has happened? How does this
Yeah.
moral structure that you're claiming,
Mm-hmm.
you're claiming that something immoral has occurred? So you're
Mm-hmm.
claiming the spirit of the objective eternal spirit of morals and ethics. So you're saying, like, I am going to harm your reputation on the authority that you're being immoral or unethical. So then it's like, okay, well, what's your argument? And it's like, well, I just think that it's like, so what's your argument that says
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that's allowed for these people? But what about all these other people who
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
make the
Yeah.
same claim? Like,
Yep. 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 Yep.
and
Yeah.
it's and then go back to the first episode of the first season. It's just like none of this makes any sense, and the
Yep.
fact that it has so much power is baffling beyond belief. And
Well,
what it's
so I don't think I actually don't think that it's that unintelligible. I think I think that the degree to which people have been deceived is actually a testimony to the degree to which they were trying to live in harmony with themselves and those around them, which
mm,
means the degree to which they were trying to behave ethically,
yes, yes, yes,
specifically in
yes,
the
yes,
sense that we've outlined here,
yes,
right?
yes, 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 yes.
The reason why it was allowed to occur was because there is a component of the ethic that we actually haven't necessarily touched on yet, which maybe we should flesh out a little bit more. But
Oh, we have some
I don't
time if
think.
you want to flesh it out. If I
No,
mean,
no. I
depending
mean,
on
I think I have to think about it some more. But basically, it has to do with when you observe a violation, what do you do? And I think that the answer is something like you need to be strong enough to say no.
yes, 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 yes,
Um,
and that strength
but
comes. Yeah,
that's
sorry.
like a really that's something really difficult because as soon as you say no, that thing is going to turn violent. Not
Mm,
necessarily physically violent, but it's going to rear its head in a way that's like, okay, like, yep, here comes the this is the demon or
yeah,
this is the
yeah,
dragon. It's going
yeah,
to come, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
so and you're going to have to deal with the consequences of that. And what people do is they threaten to destroy not you, they threaten to destroy your reputation,
yep,
your livelihood, your children, your family, their capacity to make money, right?
yeah,
So like that's how evil and violent this thing has become, is that it tries to totally demolish everything about you,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And when this first started, like back in 2016 and 2017,
yeah,
uh like it's amazing that anybody stood up against it,
Yeah. Well,
Because I mean, like, if someone said to you, yeah, like, so I'm going to come to you, and if you don't agree with what I'm going to do, then I'm literally going to remove everything from your life. Like you think Job's life was bad, yours is going to be 10 times worse, 100 times
mm,
worse.
yeah. Well, I don't know. Job's life was pretty bad,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think at the core of it is, to me, what's happening is so nakedly
Immoral.
unethical and immoral,
Yeah.
and logically irrational. And
Yep.
that will be another argument where I can actually lay down from an information theoretic point of view why the language they're asking you to adopt is is fundamentally at odds with how language works as we've described it in this podcast. And that
Hmm.
it actually doesn't have the capacity to create an object that allowed you to discern what,
Hmm.
to create a demarcation to say something
Yeah.
that this
Yeah.
is consistent with information or it's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And so in other words, what I'm noticing is that someone comes to me and tells me to adopt an illogical structure into my language, and there's an intimate relationship between your language and your spirit. So you're
Hmm.
asking me to incorporate within my spirit something that is purely illogical, so that so that I so you're asking me to do that first, and then you're asking me to do it to validate the identities of other people while telling me that I need to invalidate my identity. And you're saying you're doing this out of compassion when there's clearly no compassion for me or my
Yeah. Yeah.
feelings.
Yep. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's like every single
Yeah.
aspect
Because
of it
it's
is
really about,
corrupted.
wow. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, because at the end of the day, you're saying something
Yeah.
like, I'm saying this on the authority of these people's feelings. So then it's like, well, what about my feelings? And it's like, well, your feelings don't count, but you're claiming that this is coming from a compassion and desire for like your compassion for other people's
Yeah.
feelings,
Yeah.
but you're
Yep.
asking me to sacrifice my own feelings at the
Yep.
same time. So it's like,
Yep.
clearly the thing that you're claiming is the motivation of your action is not
Yep.
the motivation of your
Yep.
action.
Yep.
And and
Yep.
so and so and so when you look at a lot of these ideas that are surrounding this
Yep.
wokeness, it's almost all of them are based off of things that are fundamentally not consistent with things like morals, ethics, or logic, and then
Yep.
enforced through coercion and
Yep.
threatening of one's reputation and spirit. And it's just
Yeah.
like, this is just all evil all the way down. I don't see any good in it.
Yes. That's exactly right. I mean, I think, so this is why I've thought for a very long time now that basically what this is, what we're living through right now, is the concrete expression of um, of the archetype of the negative feminine. Like, I think
Mm,
that's basically what this is.
yeah.
Um, so I mean, I think that actually puts a very solid
Good
point.
cap.
Yeah. So but maybe we just summarize that really
Hey,
quickly. So
Murphy.
like the
Murphy.
so the key idea here is that
Hey, buddy.
this in this particular example, the reason why this is unethical is because what it attempts to do is obfuscate the coherence, or seeks to not undermine but rather make incoherent the natural relationship between one's individual conception of being and one's lived expression of being, as it's made an effort to subordinate itself to a transcendental thing,
Hmm.
or the universe of transcendental things, right? So like basically it's an effort to sever the individual from God.
Yes,
Like,
yes, 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 yes.
and that's fundamentally why it's wrong.
And that's the nature of sin.
So yeah,
Oh, how
right,
about
exactly.
that? Um, and that is the nature of sin. And this is the nature that, when infested within an identity, creates this corruption that
Hmm.
threatens the existence of it in its life, which
Hmm.
leads to death, which is the nature of sin.
Hmm.
And part of what, one last thing I want to wrap up is that in this act of being citizens, the question is, what do I owe the other citizens? What do I owe my, like basically your ethics comes down to, what relationship do you have? I have a child. What is my responsibility to my child? I have my wife. What,
Hmm.
and under, like, I know for a fact, another reason why I know this is so unethical is I know for a fact that if a society adopts the idea that you must do this thing because I declare it's moral, otherwise, if you don't agree with me, I have the right to use force on you. That mode of being, when injected into any group, is going to create death and chaos and fighting and war.
Yeah, that's right.
If you try to enact it out, it will create death.
Yep.
And you know for a fact that when you enter into a relationship with your spouse, that you just can't come and start demanding that they bow to your will and do everything you say. You can't
Yep.
do that. I can't go to my neighbor and do that. Like,
Yep.
so the nature of what you can ask of somebody depends on your relationship with them. And within the citizenry, especially within the West, within that citizenry, no one has the right to tell you to use specific words. That's insane. That's
Mm-hmm.
madness.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I want to end it on, is that this is such a clear violation of what you owe me and what I owe you, because I know for a fact that I can't do this to you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a great place to end it.
All right, man. Well, thanks for joining me, Ryan. So far, I am very happy with this series of this season. I'm very glad that I came to meet you, and that you were able to help me facilitate this idea and this message. And when we met, I remember you were focused on the concept of evil. Like, hey, man, so am I. Let's do some podcasts about it, and here we are. So
Well,
yeah,
the pleasure's mine.
yeah, man. So I want to thank Ryan for being here, and for everybody else, stay turtling, my friends. Peace.